It was the turn of the 20th century, and the disciplines of art and film were about to converge in a way that would change our perception of the world forever. If still photography had already had a profound effect on mid-19th century artists, especially Manet, what influence would motion pictures have on the next generation? By 1893, Edison's kinetoscope was an international sensation, but only one person at a time could view this miniature world of movement. Edison's ultimate objective was to do for the eye what his phonograph had done for the ear. But in 1895, it would be the Lumiere brothers in Paris advancing Edison's technology and introducing the cinematograph projecting motion pictures. It was one of a range of remarkable new technologies, including aviation, that promised the annihilation of time and space as it was known.
To think of Cubism more in terms of geometry and structure. The truth is that it is a technological art. It's involved with what we've come to know as the Industrial Revolution, and we've forgotten the revolution part of it. It really was a revolution in how people thought of themselves, not just in terms of technology, but how technology changed people themselves, their whole view of their world and of their relation to it. And Picasso and Braque were born into this world. Picasso comes from a family of painters. His father was a teacher of drawing at the Academy in Madrid. At a certain point, he took his brushes and gave them to his son, surrendering the tradition to him. Braque also came from a family in which there were painters. His family business was the decoration business in Le Havre, but his father was an amateur fine art painter in his spare time and encouraged his son to follow in the family business, but also to paint in his spare time. And finally, Braque made the choice to be a painter rather than a decorator.
There's a certain way that in the arts generally, how to portray emotion, basically through still media like painting or drawing or sculpture, had always been an issue. Photography, when it appeared in the 19th century, had to be very still because it had a very long exposure time. But starting around the 1880s and into the 1890s, still photography began to become instantaneous photography. You could see something with a photograph that you can't see with your naked eye. And the idea that if you could get instantaneous exposures, you could make motion pictures began to occur to people like Muybridge and Marais. But immediately people thought, well, if you can do that, you could also not just analyze motion, but synthesize it, recreate it, really record a moment.
When Picasso was 15 years old, he saw his first films. It was 1896, Barcelona. He went to a screening in a place called the Sala Napoleon. There was one film in particular that struck him, and it was The Charge of the 17th French Cuirassiers. And Picasso was sharing his first studio with his friend Pagliares. He went back to that studio and made a painting that drew on that charge of these French soldiers, but combined it with a painting source by Maria Fortuny. And he became an instant cinephile, and he and his friends went to the cinema over and over again. In the program that Picasso saw, there were 12 or 13 films, and the apparatus could be seen in the room, so one could see how this mechanism operated right from the beginning. One could see what the film looked like. One could hear the clicking and the whirring of the mechanism turning over. And so it had a kind of animal quality that people responded to.
For conservative aestheticians, this idea was one of the things that condemned cinema. It could never be an art form. It was simply a machine. Film, of course, is motion pictures. And that's so obvious that I think we very often don't think about how extraordinary it had to be for the audiences seeing them for the first time. Not just for the technical novelty, you know, that suddenly they were seeing motion pictures, but literally for the possibility of recording motion itself. You're actually preserving time in its flight, time in its progression, and motion itself, particularly of the human body, but also of natural phenomenon, waves, the leaves in the trees, which artists had often referred to, either in poetry or in painting, but had never literally captured. Film could do that. And that is more than just a normal recording function. It is opening up a whole new way of seeing and a whole new vision.
One of the things that I really like about the experience of the early films is that it's a lot like when somebody has a camera for the first time or has the ability to take a picture for the first time without thinking about it. They walk around and they take a picture of that. Oh, I'll take a picture of that, you know, and I'll take a picture of that. They find something that is just of a contrast or just something different, and they take a picture of that. And the same thing, you know, in some of the early movies, the guy said, wow, I can take a picture of that. So you got a bunch of guys walking around, or you got people doing very simple, basic human kinds of things that these guys got a chance to see for the first time and record for the first time. They also got a chance to relive time in a way that hadn't existed before. And as far as I'm concerned, a really exciting thing, they got a chance to monkey with it. And so that you can see the first guys who figured out about how to do some of these things. They said, this is so neat. I can speed up time. Oh, gee, if I wind the camera and make it go slower, I get this herky-jerky motion that becomes more hysterical and kind of peculiar and launches into a kind of another fantasy realm. Then some other bright spot figured out, you know, since all the film was double perf in those days, I can take the film and I can make it run upside down and backwards, and I can have time go backwards. I mean, can you imagine how, it seems to me remarkable that idea was. I mean, remarkable enough to turn me on like all these years later, so I still do it. Sometimes with a lot of screens and overlapping sound.
I'm standing across from T&T Surplus. This is the Canal Street of Kingston. There you can find any kind of surplus that you can make.
From earliest surviving drawings we know that Picasso was intoxicated with all forms of popular culture around him. This is a lifelong obsession, a lifelong love. He loved the tauromachia, the bullfight. He came from a world awash in visual signs and in visually coded meanings, the most passionate meanings, the Eucharist, the symbols of the Mass. But he also came from a place in Malaga where, without saying a word, you could glare at them. But by how you held your fan, you could say, meet me on the balcony at 3. And in fact, there was a very elaborately coded language of fans. In fact, there were multiple language of fans. And in his Cubist works, Picasso, and before as well, I mean, for years, Picasso includes images of fans. But in some works, the body parts actually become folded like a fan, the nose, the ridges under the eye, the cheek, the forehead. And then in some of the images which also so deeply evoke the handheld movie cameras, the diaphanous, wispy, soft monochrome of the very first cinema. They also evoke the fluttering of a fan. For centuries, there had been tremendous interest in optics and perspective. And it turns out that these interests were superseded in teaching at large. And yet you see in his little elementary school textbooks, he was fascinated and kept drawing different points of view. He loved bringing in letters and numbers and musical notes, all issues which would become so central to Cubism. And these only surface when he comes to the enabling environment of Paris.
Picasso first comes to Paris in 1900. He's going to the Exposition Universelle, which is an enormous kind of World's Fair. One of the things that brings him is he has a small painting in an exhibition of Spanish art. At the fair, the Lumiere brothers had a huge screen, 15 by 27 meters, and on it they projected some of those same films that Picasso had seen initially. The other thing that Picasso would have seen at the Exposition Universelle was Loie Fuller, the American dancer who was very well known in Paris.
Loie Fuller was an import from Chicago, actually. She'd had a little success in the United States, but she was brought to Paris in 1893 to be at the Folies Bergère, and she introduced this dance that she had already pioneered in the United States and gotten some attention with, which she called the Serpentine dance. Instead of accenting footwork, it accented form in the shape of these enormous billowing cloths. So you've got a dance that's totally thought about almost as a work of changing sculpture, mobile sculpture. She had stage assistants bathing her in constantly changing light, a spectacle that is like nothing that anyone had ever seen.
Loie Fuller, c'est épatant. Sur le bi, sur le bout, sur le bi du bout du banc. Mais ce Rodin est un salaud. C'est zéro au terreau. Ah, voilà, un numéro. Max Jacob.
Generally, dances were extremely popular subject matter for early cinema. But the Serpentine dance was undoubtedly the most popular. In every country where somebody was operating a camera, they got someone, often not as skilled as Fuller, but who could manipulate the cloth and could give this kind of spectacled motion in this new recording. But what about the color? There was not yet the possibility of color cinematography, but people came up with a brilliant solution, which is that they actually would tint the film itself. They were able to give again that sense of a constant metamorphosis of color. People who were involved with organizing the exposition understood that they were marking a moment of self-conscious transformation and change, a moment where the modern was entering into daily life, and that this involved technology and it involved art. And bridging the two was the idea of movement. Many things at the 1900 exposition marked this. Fuller and the Lumieres, but also the sense of the new art, the sense of the new technology, new aspects of the exposition, the moving sidewalk, for instance, which circled around the exhibition. Not only were you moving through the exposition, but you had a mobile view of the exhibition. It was as though everything was in motion.
What I could never explain about Cubist paintings was that there was a thinness to the illusion that didn't relate to the flatness of modernism, and there was a way that the light sources sort of interrupted the edges of the painting, or the way the painting sort of thinned out at the edges, which now I see in conjunction with film has more to do with the thinness of a cinematic projection, which is a light projection, and also that there's a kind of extraneous light source in Cubism, and that is almost as though a door had been opened during a dark room projection and sort of splattered an interruption of light onto the surface. And I had never really thought about it in those terms before. But I was introduced to Cubism much later than I was introduced to film. So a lot of the inspiration in my work, in terms of the look of it, has more to do with sort of the filmic aspects than it does with the formalist art, modernist concerns anyway. What film does is try to show you a believable illusion that you just go into. You don't break it down in terms of its construct. What you do is you see a dramatic moment in which two people are talking, you know, there's a story going on, etc. And in that way, that relates to what my ambition is in my work.
When I was in my 20s, I used to go to the movies a lot, and I'd watch Kurosawa's film of The Seven Samurai. And you see these guys riding on horses in the rain and in the mud, and you're seeing this on a giant screen, and you think, well, how does painting compete with this? And you realize, or I realized, that what I liked about painting is that painting was still, and that the movies were moving, and that was good for the movies, but I liked the fact that paintings were static. Now, that doesn't mean that the combination or the syntax, the dialectic of what's going on inside of the painting can't generate something outside of it that is moving. And that's really what happens. The simultaneous quality, I mean, when you look at a painting, you get everything immediately. The beginning, the middle, and the end, and then you get the beginning and the middle and the end again. The process of time, the temporal quality of that, is the time spent looking. When you're watching a movie, you have to wait until it's over to kind of get the full, I guess, resolved object that you're going to digest afterwards. You start looking at these films in the context of these paintings, and then you start to look at even the marks on the film, marks that have nothing to do with the images that are in the film. You start to realize that you're looking at everything and all of it has meaning. And you start dissecting what you're looking at, and that essentially is what Cubism is. People were dissecting how they were seeing. So the reason why there's no color in these paintings is because they're sitting in a movie theater and they're sitting in the dark. And the thing that I've always loved about going to the movies is, you know, you get in the dark, and just as you start to watch the movie, there's this kind of, you're enveloped by this non-color or the sense of floating. And then you can leave your body.
The first time I really saw some of the Méliès films, I knew Méliès was a magician, and very, very early films. We saw a few on television, but they were very badly presented. But I saw a few in history of film class that Haig Manoogian, my teacher, gave at Washington Square College in the motion picture department in 1960. This film is made up, in the case of Méliès, you say, well, it's one angle usually, but something to the nature of the way he shoots it, and the size of the frame, and also the tricks that are used within the frame. And so during that time, especially when they started to invent cinematic language as they were going along, really, I mean, they had to. Very often they thought if they moved the camera in, you know, the old story, that the exhibitors were saying people won't know, they won't understand. They won't know that that face belongs to the person who had just been in a wide shot. But they had to take a chance on it and try it. All of them did. I find, though, that ultimately, in an odd way, and this is what's so interesting about the film itself, and that's why I'm having a difficult time making the transition to digital. I don't understand the ones and the zeros. I understand the frame. I understand the perforations. I could see the celluloid. I could taste it. I know it. And I see the frame line. And the frame line and the perforations become part of the film for me, the nature of the film. There's something that happens psychologically when those perforations and those frames are going through the interlock motor of the projector. And ultimately, you know, does the film exist at all? It doesn't. It exists only in your mind by these images that are being projected and light being refracted in different ways. And if that light changes, by the way, you can see the same film in two different projection systems or two different projection situations, and it's a different movie. So it's such an ephemeral art form that it's always surprising and unique. Yes, for me, the Lumiere films, some people say, well, it's just a shot of a train coming into a station. That angle has to be chosen. You had to make a creative choice as to where to place that camera so that it stays with you 100, 150 years later. It still has impact. But the Méliès is like, and the early Edison films, especially the Frankenstein, give me an impression of the feeling when I was young, when I went to see films, when I could escape into a film from wherever I was and go up there on the screen and live in the film if I connected with it. But really what you're living, unless it's a very hardcore, straight narrative picture, you're living a dream. They're photographing the dreams. And I think it's a very interesting thing, how you can actually have a machine create something which is very complex to describe in language, literary language. It's imagery. It's how you create something that has an ephemeral nature, that is an impression with this equipment, which is very, very physical, you know? Now, in The Departed, in the last page of the script, after one of the main characters is killed, the writer, William Monahan, wrote a phrase, and then a strange thing happens. A rat comes out. Okay. When I went to shoot it, the translation, the rat was fairly easy to put in the frame. We had a train rat. The image of the man who was shot, that's fairly easy. I had a sense of where the camera was going to be. I knew what I wanted to do. But the problem was the phrase, and then a strange thing happened. How do you convey that on film? It has to be through the angle that you're using. It has to be through a lens you use. A lens is a very physical, very concrete element. It has to be the lighting. And it has to be we're creating these strange things. They were making these strange things happen on film. They were already dealing with this problem that I got caught up short with a year ago on film, on the set, and in the editing room. I tried many different ways to create that, quote, strange thing happening. But Méliès did it.
Loewy forms the link from film to painting for Picasso. She is what puts the Demoiselles d'Avignon into movement with the motion of the drapes. The Demoiselles are usually thought of as modeled on Iberian statues. They're thought of as static. In fact, the Demoiselles d'Avignon is not static. This is a case of arrested motion. There were also films of the strongman Eugene Sandow. Sandow had been photographed by Muybridge. He was then filmed by Edison. His act, too, was a vaudeville act. He, too, became a link for Picasso to his paintings of 1907, 1908. And here we have to revert also to Méliès. One of Méliès' favorite tricks was to cut apart bodies and rearranging them. Two-dimensional forms suddenly transform into three-dimensional forms. And that happens in the Demoiselles d'Avignon. The Demoiselles is Picasso's breakout picture. It's his declaration of his taking over the mastery of art. It's intentional. It was meant to provoke. And in fact, when Braque came to see it for the first time, he was provoked by it. He found it very unpleasant. People found the painting very, very unpleasant. One of the things that's so unsettling about the picture is that it's mediating between stasis and movement. It's the negotiation between the interests of painting and this new apparatus that's taken over vision. This is an apparatus that can go backwards and forwards in time. It can do anything. And Braque and Picasso are in competition with history, and they want to take over. This painting is traditionally described in terms of Cézanne's bathers, and indeed, Cézanne was a great presence on the scene and was the impetus for Picasso to begin this painting. The other painting that Picasso has in view and is in competition with is Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, so that there's the history of art embedded in this painting, but it's rerun. It's being filmed through this deus ex machina, the cinematograph, which is now intervening and allowing Braque and Picasso to repeat, to restructure vision according to modern principles.
The rise of the cinema as a popular entertainment form is really quite extraordinary. When it was born and when it arrived in culture, it was first integrated into the entertainment landscape that was already existing, which was the café concert, for example. An entertainment form of live performance, of singing, joke-telling live acts called the revue. But it was also very quickly incorporated into the circuses, which was, if we want to think about it, was the first tradition of distribution. We see the cinema also entering into spaces like the department store. The Dufayel department store was a central place where people could, before 1903, see some of the earliest films. By 1906 or 7, cinema was actually replacing live acts. And what we see, too, is a sort of crisis in the culture of the café concert, a crisis that's basically being felt by the actors and by the performers who are realizing that the cinema is replacing them. Going to the cinema during this period is very much a neighborhood affair. We've got cinemas that are cropping up in every single neighborhood in Paris, a kind of explosion in the number of cinema houses. And so by 1913, we have a completely independent cinema culture. When Picasso and Braque went to the movies, they were going into this theater that was a very mixed space for classes, for men and women. This was a new spatial environment. This was an unruly environment, a bit bawdy, a bit risque, a space where people could be a bit freer of the social constraints. This is a culture of people who are discovering the cinema as a social event, as something that's also becoming an intellectual, aesthetic topic. Because by 1913, too, we have also a narrative tradition, which is finally articulating itself for the first time in a very full way. We have the artists discovering the first serial films by Louis Feuillade and the Fantomas series that became extremely important to the avant-garde because it represented a kind of fantastic Parisian underworld. It represented the cinema's links with popular literature. And we have the first indications of a real cinephilic culture when we have Max Jacob and Apollinaire creating a fan club called the Friends of Fantomas.
Well, I mean, the idea that they create this society to honor this criminal who is also a master of disguises. And of course, Picasso, all his life, was fascinated with disguises. He was fascinated with explicitly naming something and then renaming it and then renaming it again. Turned out virtually everyone in Picasso's circle renamed themselves, rebaptized themselves, recreated themselves in every imaginable way.
My affair with Picasso began when I was about 18 or 19 in high school, and I made a couple of cubist drawings and then mailed them to Rutgers, and I got a scholarship. So I owe him big, you know. When I see what Picasso is doing, especially around the time of 1909 or something, he looks like an anatomist, you know, a doctor of anatomy who opens up his brain. There's all this gray and brown matter. And it's as if this segment shows, oh, there's an apple there. This segment has a nipple. And then, simply by assembling them, you get the painting. The figures tend to be single figures, whereas before, here's two people talking to each other. And it's almost as if he's talking to them. There's just him, Picasso or Braque, and then there's the figure that he's building, and there's nothing else. So the communication is very direct, open, and tends to be mysterious. There's a huge amount of caricature involved. Now, caricature was a big deal in 19th century France, and maybe other countries too. But with him, it's both graphic caricature as well as caricature that existed in early films as well as later films. I see his portraits having expressions that are characteristic, but also sort of drowned in mood, a certain kind of mood, and it's not French mood. We know he comes from Spain, so there's this dark Spanish element. Whereas caricature itself, it tends to be just funny and a little bit grotesque. But Picasso added this other thing, which is, it's a real feeling. It's like a real smell, real texture.
In 1907, it was Apollinaire who introduced Braque to Picasso. And it's interesting to know that it was a poet who introduced the two painters. Very early on, Apollinaire was named by Picasso le pape du cubisme. Picasso lived in the Bateau Lavoir, and there were many poets who visited him. Braque was more introvert. He liked to play music, but he stayed at home. He was not interested to create a coterie around him. With Picasso, it just happened. Braque had been very much interested in the fauves, the wild beasts, but had moved on by being interested so much in Cézanne to a more formal simplification of landscape. Those paintings he offered to be part of the salon, and the paintings were refused. Kahnweiler, the dealer, said, "I will show your landscapes." And he asked Apollinaire to write the introduction.
His compositions have the harmony and plentitude we were waiting for. He no longer owes anything to his surroundings. Georges Braque knows no rest, and every one of his paintings commemorates an effort that no one before has yet attempted.
It was later on that Braque said to Dora Follier, "We both had come to a similar form of vocabulary, and after that we began to work nearly as one man. We were two mountain climbers held together by a rope. C'était un petit peu comme la cordée en montagne." Not one painting would be finished, as Picasso said, unless Braque had seen it. And not one painting of Braque would be finished unless Picasso had seen it. Braque said they spoke with each other nearly in code. He says, if you would listen to our talks, you wouldn't understand it. It was only understandable for the two of us. And in retrospect, we have nothing to say. It all went into our paintings. As a sculptor, I, of course, love those paintings. To me, they are very sculptural. Braque is more painterly. He keeps his small cubes more open. There is more possibility to feel an ambiguity. With Picasso, it's hard and faceted and no transition, and it's so daring to me.
Can you do this? You know, just in the kind of daily conversation that poets and artists would have. Well, so-and-so did this. Can this be done in this medium? And I think that exchange was very fruitful for the poets and the artists. It got them to think about language differently, the notion of just juxtaposing one thing against another without the kind of narrative continuity that had come to be expected in discursive 19th century poetry. And I think the artists got a huge amount because they were listening to these poets talk about, like, what about this, what about that, let's go to the movie, let's go see a film. What's wonderful about the films, I think, is that they're hokey and real at the same time. And I think that the hokiness of the stage set and the realness of these people moving through space is something they saw through that, I think, instantly. They didn't see it as a fiction. I mean, they saw it as a fiction in which real things were moved around. You see how the machine operates, how the magician plays the trick. And somehow in film, I feel like the magician reveals himself or herself in some way because of the stage set. Somehow everything seems fake and real at the same time. And I think that's something that didn't exist previously in quite the same way. And I think that's something that the Cubists got.
Which is transformed, which is one of the key aspects of film. I think it's related to Cubist imagery because of the conceptual foundation of Cubism. I think the closest relationship of early film with Cubism is at the conceptual level. It is the idea of a simple object transforming, uniting with a human subject, and then the literal aspect of just simply a fold of a paper, a fold of a shape. Also, the simple camera move, tilt up, tilt down, or go off screen to another location. Very, very simple devices that make the point to tell something very simple, but to tell it in a complex way. Also, the fact that the accordion and musical instruments were important to the Cubists, Braque himself being an accordionist, whether or not they saw this film, the fact that it is the subject of an early film, and also the sense of destroying tradition. When early films were first shown, they were not highly accepted by upper middle class, and they were not considered a legitimate art. And there is the reference, I think, undoubtedly to the Manet painting, this clash of the vulgar, popular with the classical. I mean, in many ways, the film does take traditional art forms and makes a literal pun of it. That would be something very appealing to the Cubists.
Cinema was always very close to Picasso's heart, very much part of his life. And I think one of the effects that he took, consciously took, was the close-up. And so much of Picasso's work is to do with gigantism. He really wanted to make the image as big as possible. He had all kinds of different ways of doing this, largely by cutting the head off short and cramming the figure in. For instance, the Prague self-portrait is so crammed in and is so big that eyes are so enormous, it looks exactly like self-portrait in an early movie. There were lots of stories about going to the movies. I mean, but just before 1914 and on into the war, his great friend Serge Ferrat ceased to be a great friend once Picasso had pinched his girlfriend, Irene Lagut. But Serge Ferrat and the Baroness d'Oettingen kept, as it were, a special box in their local movie house. And people could drift in and out. I mean, friends of his, and they all had a sort of card. They could go in and sit there for a bit. And he preferred, I think, unpretentious films. I don't think he was all too keen on what we might call art films. He loved slapstick comedies. He was a great admirer of Chaplin. And of course, he adored cowboy movies. And Braque and Picasso, they loved seeing each other as cowboys, boxers, and this was all sort of part of the game of life. I mean, it was the way that film at that time was sort of encroaching on life and taking up a greater part in people's lives, and the references to film in general conversation as well as in his work. For all their closeness, Picasso and Braque, I mean, they were closer than any two other painters of the 20th century. They were competitive. And I lived for many years in France with Douglas Cooper, who had the greatest collection, private collection of Cubist painting, drawings, sculpture, everything else. And one of the most treasured things in this collection was the first papier collé ever done, the one that Braque did behind Picasso's back in September 1912. And Picasso used to come to the house quite a lot because we were near the bullfighting country, and after bullfights we'd give a dinner and he'd come and go around the paintings with him. And one day he looked again and again, rather ferociously, at the Braque collage, which we know the papers in the collage Braque had found in a wallpaper shop in Avignon. And so Picasso said, you know, I think on my way back I'll stop at the wallpaper shop and buy some more of that paper and show Braque how I would have done it.
Cubism doesn't have a manifesto. And part of its intensity, part of the reason why it remains interesting to us, is that it doesn't have a manifesto, that it's a series of openings out onto new kinds of experience and onto new kinds of art. We've learned over the years to read those headlines in Cubist pictures, not just as arbitrary choices, but as meaningful choices. Our future is in the air, quite literally, as part of the sloganeering of the painting. We can talk about Cubism in flight in a very meaningful way. Cubism and the Wright brothers, Cubism and the idea of aviation. We sense their love for flight and their nicknaming each other, Orville and Wilbur. And we've learned over the years to understand the Cubist jokes. Majoli, taking up a popular song, wasn't arbitrary. It involved actually being open to popular music. In the movies, you have a very powerful model of just how much distortion, changes of viewpoint, changes of ideas, back and forth between titles and images. All of those things suddenly give you a new model of what a work of art can be. And I think that it's that sense of a new rhythm for painting that you feel very strongly in collage. And I think that the deepest resemblances between what Picasso and Braque were doing, what the first filmmakers were doing, comes in that sense of permissions given, old restrictions removed, possibilities opened.
I very much liked at the Palais Rochechouart A rather nice movie that depicted the adventures of a lazy
toute
manual
attention
laborer whose work did
ornementale,
itself.
anecdotique, symbolique, Picasso réalise une
Dare I or don't I? Well, take courage and trust in the grace of God. Now, Fantomas, what nobility.
The Rêve d'Opium of Cinema's Pathé touched us very much. It is the unfortunate adventure of an English writer with pipes, postage stamps, postcards, or playing cards, candelabras.
Nothing is closer to the people than cinema. The man who projects a film today plays the role that the juggler did in the old
Georges Braque knows no rest, and every one of his
Picasso studies an object like a surgeon dissects a cadaver.
The most philosophical, the most abstract of all Cubist art critics was Maurice Renard. And if you read his work, he frames it in terms of Kant, he frames it in terms of abstraction, to a degree that not only would you never know the cinema had ever been invented, it was as though Cubist pictures didn't exist as physical objects. It's pure abstraction. And yet it turned out he was the first sustained film critic. He loved the cinema. Now this at first was such a complete aberration because Cubism depended absolutely on a belief that you had to distance art from mimesis, that you rejected nature, its tainted materialism, the fact that it was just a bourgeois, empty form of artistic practice. And so most Cubist critics hated cinema because they hated photography, because it was mimetic, it reproduced nature. And so they were consistent, they were intellectually pure in this sense. But there were a few who allowed themselves to love cinema because the chasm seemed so profound, it was as though there was this sort of louche world that they could love, and then there was art with a capital A. They could go slumming with gusto in the cinema. And in fact, Renard talks about how the cinemas were dark and people would be feeling each other up and smooching and drinking and smoking. And he talked about these raucous, raunchy disjunctions that are such kindred spirits to Cubism, but he obviously was completely oblivious that he was responding to a similar sensibility. And there's even more. I mean, the first extended discussion of cinema was by Rémy de Gourmont, who was a great symbolist. And he talks about how he was responding to, in a split second, you could be in this country, in that country, and a second later you'd move from a desert to the ocean. And in the archetypal definition in 1912 by Glaise and Messenger, in effect, they characterized Cubism in cinematic terms and didn't realize it. So it's this really fascinating sense that within the culture, there were all kinds of convergences, and yet many people simply weren't aware because they were so programmed that there was this apocalyptic break between cinema and art with a capital A.
One of the things I love about these paintings is how the color has just been sucked out of it. It's almost like taking a color television and turning the color down. Maybe, I'm not sure what they were thinking, but in my case, I just didn't want to depend on color. I didn't want to depend on color to carry the painting. I wanted the structure and the information to be, something that didn't depend upon the kind of entertainment value of color. That is, that if you don't like anything else you're looking at least you're looking at some beautiful color. And I think also there is in limitation an ability to focus on the other issues because you've gotten color out of there. Can you still make a painting that's interesting? The thing that I recognized the most and felt a kind of personal urgency with was the extreme artificiality of Cubism. It was not about space. It was not about atmosphere. It was not about the way we see things in nature. It's highly compressed, insistently flat. You are always aware that you're looking at distribution of colored dirt on a flat surface. And then emerging out of that in a fractured and totally unrealistic way, pieces of imagery that begin to coalesce in your mind. And that whole notion of making an image is something that I've been involved with in a different way. I want the viewer always to be aware of the fact that it is as artificial as it is real. And it's the tension between the artificiality and the reality that makes the difference. You know, style is embedded in process. That's where the rubber meets the road in painting. You have the thought process of the artist. And that's a contemporary experience for you. It's like you're watching it happen in front of your very eyes. You can deconstruct it and then construct it back again. And in that process, it's yours, it's your experience.
One of the things that is extremely important to think about is not only the way that this new, modern, technological, constantly changing environment was something that Braque and Picasso were responding to, but that their paintings capture it. I'm not talking about a literal reproduction, but the fact that the paintings operate like films. If you look at them statically, I don't think they work. But if you look at them as progressing, as moving, as creating their own interplay between the various elements and facets, suddenly all that breaking up into individual elements and variations makes sense. Now, would they have done that if film had never existed? It's possible. But the important thing is film did exist, and film was something that they were seizing upon as both something they could learn from and, to put it bluntly, something they could teach something to.
One of the things that I think makes Cubism, in the simplest sense, such a beautiful moment in the history, not just of Western art, but the history of the Western imagination, is its ability to make us feel deeply the promise of the new, that the possibilities that are right there in front of us in flight, in the newspaper, in the caricature journal, in the movies, that those things aren't a threat to high culture. Those things aren't things that mark the end of artistic originality, but that they can be incredibly powerful stimulants, incredibly powerful resources for art, for painting, for the oldest of forms, to go on and to renew itself.
Cubism has always been more seen in the light of Picasso than of Braque. And I feel that that early period was a period where they hardly could be disentangled. The question I asked myself was, how is it possible when two artists work so intensely together that is only possible for a short period of time, that can never continue forever? And I know it because I work together with Klaus Oldenburg, and we have moments where it is very hard for us to work together. There is a will to do it, but there's something else. And that something else is so beautifully expressed in this idea of two mountain climbers, because you don't have a rope holding you while you are scaling a mountain, then there is no danger. And you feel that danger. There's always danger between these two, and one waits till the other has gone to Paris in order to do something that will be a challenge. And then the First World War broke the spell. It was over. What happens afterwards is something that can never put together that moment of excitement that these two artists had. And as Picasso said, it was our individual characters that had to express themselves because there were no more discoveries to be made.
Picasso and Braque's paintings of 1907 to 1914 are the documents that tell the story of what these two adventurers made of this phenomenon, what they took with them as a catalytic agent to tear down the conventions of representation. Cubism was not a style. It was a revolution that instigated a profoundly radical change of artistic form. In fact, a radical change in vision itself.